Urgent. The Ukrainian armed forces gave the enemy a taste of birch porridge on the front line. Footage you can't miss. Nato lent Ukraine a hand. A mega factory is starting to produce something that will finally finish off Russia. Shock, the final agreement has been leaked. The Kremlin is putting pressure on Washington. Meanwhile, Russia's shadow fleet is sinking in the Black Sea. The SBU pulled off an incredible downing of aircraft over enemy territory. All this and more in our episode of Pekelna Tohka, a triple tension on the front line. Pokrovsk has outsmarted the Russians. The bold plans of the Russian army have crashed against our defenses. Putin is beside himself with rage. Kupiansk is slipping out of the enemy's control. Our forces entered the city hard and fast. Another setback for the Russians near Huliai-Pol. Ukrainian defenders have dealt a heavy blow to the enemy. It seems the enemy has ended up in a frontline cauldron. The first details are coming up in the next report.
Don't count your chickens before they hatch? This Ukrainian proverb perfectly describes the current situation of the Russian armed forces in the Lyman direction. Yes, the occupiers managed to advance a little here, which the Zetviskori immediately reported, but they are apparently also read by Ukrainian intelligence. Thanks to this, the armed forces of Ukraine received operational data, which they immediately used.
I want to thank the Russian military corps. Timofey Yermakov. In his Telegram channel, he spoke about our positions. Thanks to this, the Ukrainians found us and took us. They killed.
At the same time, the heaviest battles on the front traditionally take place in the Pokrovsk area. A high-ranking NATO official stated that the Russians control 95% of the city. In Ukraine, however, they explain that in the West, the so-called gray zone is often attributed to the occupiers, without fully understanding the specifics of the fighting. Therefore, in reality, the situation is better, although it is still very difficult.
Today, the Russians control a large part of Pokrovsk. At present, a significant portion of the city is considered a so-called gray zone. Today, the Russians are trying to disrupt our logistics as much as possible, including those of the Mirnohrad garrison, since this is a single Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration. The Pokrovsk operation is ongoing.
At the same time, for several weeks now, Putin has been blindly repeating that Pokrovsk is completely under Russian control. According to Sky News, Russia deliberately announced the capture of Pokrovsk ahead of negotiations with the United States, which took place on December 2nd. However, in reality, the situation is completely different. Moreover, the Eastern Military Group reported that the defense forces are organizing reinforcements. Logistical routes are being set up to supply units in Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad, where intense fighting continues. And in the city itself, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to eliminate Russian occupiers in urban areas.
The 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Ukrainian Air Assault Forces, agency Reuters was told that they are holding the northern part of Pokrovsk and conducting assault operations in the southern part, where Russian troops are predominant.
Another settlement that remains in the headlines is Kupiansk. Despite daily attempts by the Russians to turn the situation around, they have not succeeded. The initiative remains with the Ukrainian armed forces, and the clearing of enemy units is already taking place on the outskirts of the city. At
the moment, the city is 50 to 60% completely under the control of the defense forces, and about another 20% is a gray zone. As always, the Special Operations Forces units performed excellently. They played a crucial role at the most critical moment.
Moreover, Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky stated that the armed forces of Ukraine are not only destroying the enemy, but also cutting off the occupiers' logistical routes. In particular, those routes the enemy uses to try to send in reserve forces.
There is no rest, the operation continues. And now, in fact, those very crucial and vital routes are currently being blocked. The ones that the enemy forces are attempting to utilize. Alarming indeed. This situation is quite concerning and truly alarming.
News has recently been coming from the Zaporizhzhia region. Our command admits that the enemy has had some success there. However, the General Staff is making every effort to stabilize the situation. And according to analysts, the pace of the enemy's advance has already been significantly reduced.
The open field, which the enemy had hoped to seize here and now, continues to hold. Some Russian units that previously tried to infiltrate this settlement were destroyed. And in principle, in the near future, I think we will see the same stabilization of the front in this sector.
Overall, in the past day, the enemy attempted to storm the positions of the armed forces over 200 times. 1,200 occupiers, as well as nearly 50 vehicles and more than a dozen artillery systems were destroyed.
This is a real breakthrough. A Ukrainian plant will be built on NATO territory, and Denmark has opened its doors. It's hard to believe. A core for ballistics. Now it will roll off the assembly line from a factory on the territory of an ally. Copenhagen has taken a decisive step. The world is giving a standing ovation, funding for armaments and the implementation of cutting-edge technologies. Denmark is doing the incredible. The armed forces of Ukraine are soaring to the skies. More details about the leap that made Russia drool. From envy, as you'll see in the following report.
A step that changes the entire architecture of European defense. For the first time in NATO history, a member country of the alliance is officially allowing Ukraine to set up defense production on its territory.
The Danish government announced the project on September 3rd, 2025, calling it a helping hand for Ukraine in its struggle to preserve sovereignty and security amid the conflict with Russia. In
the small Danish town of Vojens in southern Jutland, next to the Skridstrup air base where F-16S are on combat duty, the first piles for a Ukrainian factory are being driven into the ground. This is much more than just the construction of another industrial facility. This is the architecture of future European security.
The best help we can give Ukraine right now is to support the Ukrainian defense industry. Ukraine must become even more self-sufficient, and by welcoming the first Ukrainian company in Denmark, we are taking our step forward in support. In this way, production cannot be halted by Russian attacks, and at the same time, cooperation between Ukrainian and Danish companies will be strengthened.
The project is being implemented by the Ukrainian company 5-Point, known for developing the Flamingo rocket, one of the most successful Ukrainian innovations in recent years. But in Denmark, they will not be producing rockets, but rather their heart, the solid rocket fuel. A critically important component needed by every long-range system, every interceptor, every complex that is currently targeting Russian military objectives.
Denmark stands shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. Their fight for freedom is our fight for freedom. Putin shows every day that he will not stop. That is why we must help Ukrainians stop him. We are doing this by allowing 5-Point to establish itself in Denmark. At the same time, we are creating new ones. Closer ties between the Danish and Ukrainian defense sectors and our enterprises. This contributes to our security and creates more opportunities for Danish companies to support Europe's defense and Ukraine's fight for freedom.
The location next to the airbase was not chosen by chance. It offers ready infrastructure, enhanced security, and the possibility of integration into NATO's overall logistics routes. And Denmark is allocating 500 million kroner for this.
We are increasing the security of our own production. We understand that any production facility on the territory of Ukraine can be hit by Russian missiles and simply destroyed.
Construction is scheduled to be completed in 2026. When the plant starts operating, Europe will gain a new element of its security. Ukrainian production under the city and European production under protection. And so, for the first time since the war began, a model will emerge in which defense support for Ukraine becomes not just a response, but a long-term
They are heading to the meeting at Arms Enterprises for the significant opening of production on their very own territory to substantially help Ukraine further with advanced missile armament and crucial support, because producing solid rocket fuel is the first stage. I think the next stage will be the deployment of missiles on Danish territory as well, and in the production of Ukrainian missiles.
The day before, Denmark allocated its 28th military aid package worth 1.4 billion kroner. 100 million will be directed to finance weapons production in Ukraine under the so-called Danish model, a mechanism that Copenhagen came up with itself, which is now becoming an example for other allies. This is when a partner country not only purchases weapons but also helps develop production where it is truly needed in Ukraine. Under Ukrainian control for the Ukrainian army, over 370 million more are being allocated for the purchase of American weaponry for Ukraine through the Pearl Initiative. a mechanism that Denmark, Sweden, and Norway first launched back in 2025 by supplying missiles for the Patriot systems. This is a direct strengthening of Ukrainian air defense in the coming months. A separate portion of 80 million krona will go toward fuel, which will be purchased through the NATO Support and Procurement Agency. It might seem like a small detail, but it's precisely such details that keep the army moving. Putin has reshuffled the deck. The Americans came to face the dictator. These images shocked everyone. The Kremlin is rewriting the terms of peace and abandoning Ukraine. The US is going along with it. Europe is sounding the alarm. Russia once again has its hands untied. Washington has put on rose-colored glasses while the West stubbornly tries to take them off. Whether it will be possible to break Moscow's plans and actually achieve a just peace, more on that in a moment.
Negotiations on the peace plan between Putin, US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner lasted nearly 5 hours. An exchange of views between the American and Russian sides regarding the US peace plan took place in this format for the first time in Moscow. And according to the Kremlin, there are positive developments.
No, it will not be right. It will not be right. The point is that, in fact, such a direct exchange of opinions took place yesterday for the first time. And again, as was said yesterday, some things were accepted, some were noted as unacceptable. This is a normal working process, the path of compromise.
Putin does not reject Trump's so-called peace plan, but he does not agree with it either. Putin's special representative Dmitriev described the talks with Witkoff and Kushner as productive. Witkoff has already flown to Moscow for the 6th time this year, and apart from wasted time, there is no global result. Russia is not ready to make any concessions. It stands its ground.
In other words, Russia said it is ready to accept many points, except for those that are fundamental for Ukraine. We actually know it's the same points. What is fundamental for Russia and for Ukraine is just in completely opposite directions. Working according to this plan is most likely impossible, because for Ukraine these are also red lines. Everything else can be agreed upon by both sides, but they still can't reach an agreement.
At the same time as the meeting between Witkoff and Putin, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave an interview on Fox News. He said that right now Ukraine and Russia are fighting over a territory amounting to 20% of Donetsk region, which is under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. If these military actions are stopped and security is ensured, then in the future, Ukraine can look forward to bright prospects.
Theoretically, if everything is done right, in 10 years, Ukraine's GDP could surpass that of Russia. What is needed is to stop the war and ensure that it is never invaded or attacked again, to protect the enduring and long-term sovereignty and independence of Ukraine so that it does not become a puppet state. They are truly independent and sovereign, allowing their economy not just to recover, but to thrive and turn it into a story of prosperity.
At present, no one is giving Ukraine such guarantees. The pressure on Russia is not increasing. Therefore, only a strong Ukrainian army and successes on the battlefield are currently the only factors that will ensure further success in the negotiation process with Russia. And for this, Ukraine needs as much military support as possible. By the end of the year, Ukraine will receive $5 billion worth of weapons under the PORL program. Next year, support is expected to remain at the same level, according to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. He expects that in 2026, Ukraine's partners will allocate $1 billion per month for the purchase of weapons.
We currently have $4 billion, so this means we are really on track to reach $1 billion per month. August, September, October, November. Next year, we will again need a lot of money for the whole year. At least $1 billion. Maybe even a little more than $1 billion per month might be needed.
The head of Lithuania's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Studis Budrys, is convinced that the efforts for a peace agreement by the US will not succeed. Russia is simply trying to convince the international community that violating fundamental international principles is normal.
If we recognize Russia's territorial gains, it instantly destroys international law. The consequence will be new attacks and even more threats both for Russia's neighbors and everywhere else.
The offensive continues. They are cutting off pieces of Ukrainian territory bit by bit. Russia's economic problems are not yet that critical. And as long as there are truly no grounds in the Kremlin to seek peace, well, in fact, peace will not come.
Right now, the negotiations will be put on pause. And at this moment, it is very important that Russia does not achieve military successes at the front, but on the contrary, in order to strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position.
The Russian shadow fleet has fallen into a trap from which it seems there is no way out anymore. Putin was not told the whole truth. Tankers are going to the bottom one after another. Strikes on major maritime targets were broadcast live. The security service of Ukraine acts decisively and without hesitation. The first footage is already online. Turkey is monitoring the coastline and the situation is escalating. The maritime game is changing and the Kremlin's rules no longer apply. More details about this in the following report.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
It seems that in the Black Sea, Russian ships are no longer safe at all. Another tanker from the so-called Shadow Fleet was attacked 80 miles off the coast of Turkey. The Mid-Volga II was on a voyage from Russia to Georgia. There were 13 crew members on board. According to Ankara, no one was injured. According to Turkey's Ministry of Transport, the damaged but still moving Mid-Volga II is now heading towards Sinop and does not require assistance.
The tanker Mid-Volga II reported that it was attacked 80 miles from our coast while en route from Russia to Georgia, carrying a cargo of sunflower oil. The Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure of Turkey.
Built in 2014, the 140-meter Mid-Volga II sails under the Russian flag and belongs to the Srednevolzhskaya shipping company. Its Russia-Georgia route is a typical route for transporting agricultural products and petroleum products. Therefore, such a vessel automatically falls under increased scrutiny both from Ukraine and from international bodies that monitor possible schemes to circumvent oil sanctions. This attack became another link in the explosive series targeting the Russian Shadow Fleet. Recently, on the other side of the Atlantic near Dakar in Senegal, the oil tanker Mersin carrying a cargo of diesel fuel was hit by 4 external explosions. It is known that in August of this year, the vessel visited the Russian port of Tamanin, and previously it had repeatedly called at the port of Novorossiysk. Earlier, 2 other sanctioned Russian tankers, Cairo and Virat, were struck in the Black Sea by maritime drones, as part of a joint operation by the Security Service and the Naval Forces of Ukraine.
The Security Service of Ukraine continues active measures to cut off Russia's financial ability to wage war against Ukraine. Sea Baby maritime drones disabled vessels that could transport nearly a week's worth of oil, worth 70 million, and they helped the Kremlin circumvent international sanctions, a source in the Security Service of Ukraine noted.
These vessels are also part of the so-called Shadow Fleet of the aggressor state, which was used to bypass international sanctions. According to Ukrainian sources, both tankers suffered critical damage and have effectively been put out of operation.
This is the Mossad tactic. Some were sunk and the rest think twice or even 150 times. That's exactly how it should be. I assure you, until the same thing happens in the Baltic Sea, no one in Europe will even bother to react. I think it would be very appropriate to do this, for example, close to the territorial waters of Poland and the Baltic states. These people definitely won't notice anything. They'll just close their eyes and say, "Did someone swim there?" "No, we don't see anything. We don't know anything." And so on. That's exactly how it should be. Ideally, we should be sinking them everywhere if we have the technical capability, both in Vladivostok and here, all along the line, so they understand that there needs to be pressure, because without sinking these vessels,
nothing will happen. It will be clear to everyone that things are serious, and that's exactly how we need to operate. That's how we need to work, so that everyone always remembers you can't mess with Ukraine.
The attacks, which took place just a few dozen nautical miles from the Turkish coast, provoked a sharp reaction from Ankara. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan called these events a troubling escalation of the situation.
The war between Russia and Ukraine is clearly affecting security, shipping in the Black Sea. On Friday, there was a troubling escalation in our exclusive economic zone when merchant ships were attacked. In particular, we cannot in any way justify these attacks. They threaten the safety of ships, lives, and the surrounding environment in our exclusive zone.
As we can see, the Russian Shadow Fleet can no longer feel safe anywhere. The strikes by Ukrainian naval drones as well as high-profile attacks on tankers show that the Kremlin is losing its freedom of maneuver at sea. And every destroyed or disabled tanker, this is not only a financial blow to Moscow, but also a serious hit to the ego of the Russian little Tsar. But that's not all. At the same time, Kyiv is striking at the rear of Mother Russia. In November, the armed forces of Ukraine attacked Russian oil refineries with drones at least 14 times. According to Bloomberg, this is a record number of strikes on Russia's strategic oil infrastructure since the start of the full-scale war. Russian aviation is experiencing severe turbulence. Sanctions have done their job. Aging planes are breaking down more often than Russia can manage to cover it up. Cancelled flights, emergency landings, and interrupted routes. The aircraft fleet is wearing out and there aren't enough spare parts. Flying planes instead of servicing them is becoming the norm. Russia is sitting on a ticking time bomb. And now the question isn't if a plane will crash, but when and which one. You need to hear this first. They've flown themselves into trouble. Russian civil aviation is visibly deteriorating. I
can probably add something here. From
January to the end of November 2025, the number of incidents involving Russian airline planes increased by about 4 times, compared to the same period. During this time, over 800 cases of malfunctions were recorded in the country, which led to flight cancellations or emergency interruptions. Whereas during the same period in 2024, there were no more than 200 such incidents.
Will we be flying Vladimir Vladimirovich, and on what? We will, of course we will.
But whether there will be anything to fly on and how safe it will be, this year, Russian commercial aviation has seen 2 accidents and 2 air disasters, in which 53 people lost their lives. As the Moscow Times reports, the largest of them was the crash of an Angara Airlines An-24 at the end of July. The aircraft was manufactured in 1976.
This is primarily due to the deterioration of the technical condition of the Russian aviation fleet and Russian civil aircraft. Nevertheless, we can see that precisely in the previous year and actually at the beginning of this year, Russian civil aviation authorities and the relevant civil aviation bodies have repeatedly appealed to the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, earnestly asking for the imposed sanctions against Russia to be lifted in order to allow essential access to crucial spare parts and necessary components for their aircraft operations. Boeing and Airbus, which carry 80 to 90% of all air traffic in Russia.
At the beginning of October, the head of Rosaviatsia stated that, according to the less optimistic forecast, in the next 5 years, Russia could lose 339 aircraft, including 109 foreign-made ones. Overall, according to the agency, the fleet of Russian airlines consists of just over 1,000 civil aircraft.
First of all. Secondly, we are actually talking about more than half of the Western fleet that Russia is currently operating today. According to various estimates, as of today, the fleet of the Russian Federation may include about 150 to 600 Western airliners, about a third of which can no longer be used in regular operation. This is because frequent breakdowns or the lack of spare parts for repairs lead to these planes either sitting idle or falling victim to so-called aviation cannibalism.
After the war began, the Russian authorities decided to save the aviation industry and announced a program to revive the domestic aircraft industry. It was planned that the production of civil aircraft in Russia would, within just a few years, reach the level of the Soviet Union, and that by 2030 alone, companies would receive more than 1,000 domestically produced planes. But all of this turned out to be just words. At the beginning of 2025, the government decided to reduce the aircraft production plan by 1.5 times.
The level and technologies that are precisely necessary for the production of these aircraft, especially onboard systems, are critically dependent on Russia's capabilities. To purchase Western components, Western parts, Western technologies, and among other things, the appropriate equipment that is used to manufacture various components or systems.
So if we look into the future, then
the Russian forces will not possess the capability to successfully accomplish this task. It is highly improbable that they will be able to achieve this objective given their current limitations and the significant challenges they face. Therefore, any attempts they make in this regard are likely to prove unsuccessful as they lack the necessary means to execute such an undertaking effectively. For much, much longer, for a significantly considerable amount of time. This leads to decreased flight safety and a continued increase in aviation equipment failures. And as a result, we are seeing an increase in the number of air crashes, including casualties associated with them.
The lifting of Western sanctions could have saved Russian civil aviation, but such a scenario is currently impossible. And new airplanes mean long-term orders, contracts for decades, and billions of dollars, which Putin's Russia critically lacks because of the war. That's all from me for now. This was me, Darina Hatsakalo. Even more hellish news in our next episode. And in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. See you.